All right, we all know Chris. He spoke once this morning, so I'll just give a short introduction. Chris Masterjohn, PhD, is Assistant Professor of Health and Nutrition Sciences at Brooklyn College in New York. He got his PhD at the University of Connecticut, and then he went for postdoctorate work at the University of Illinois in Urbana to work with Dr. Kumaro. He is now continuing this research. The research in Illinois was on the fat-soluble vitamins, which, as you know, is a subject near and dear to our hearts. And he is continuing his research now at Brooklyn College. Chris created and maintains a website, cholesterolandhealth.com, which is home to his blog, The Daily Lipid. He has published 8 peer-reviewed scientific papers and has contributed regularly to the pages of Wise Traditions since 2004. His articles are always greatly enjoyed and appreciated because I think Chris is doing research that probably nobody else could do for us. So please join me in welcoming Chris Masterjohn.
All right, thank you all for being here. Everyone can hear me good, yeah? Okay. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the issue of chronic inflammation and how we can resolve that inflammation, meaning get rid of it, and create food tolerance, meaning not have food intolerances. Although I chose creating food tolerance in the title rather than getting rid of food intolerances deliberately because, as we'll see, resolving inflammation is an active process, and we don't tolerate foods because we don't have intolerances. We tolerate foods because our immune system has actively decided to tolerate those foods. So we're not really actually looking at getting rid of food intolerances. We're looking at how do we create universal tolerance to the foods that we should be eating. And I think this is a topic that's very relevant now because it seems that food intolerances and chronic inflammation is popping up all over the place like it never was before. And part of that is because we're getting a better understanding of the role of chronic inflammation in disease. And so now we're starting to see obesity, metabolic dysfunction, heart disease as chronic inflammation, and so on and so forth. But part of it is because these problems really are increasing. And so one nice example of that is a study where they looked at the incidence of celiac disease 50 years ago and today. And instead of just looking at who was diagnosed with celiac disease, they looked at stored blood samples from 50 years ago, verified that the antibodies in the blood were remaining stable over that period, and showed that if you use the same diagnostic criteria used now to diagnose someone with celiac disease through blood markers, you could show that it was about 4-fold less common 50 years ago than today. So there's pretty good evidence that at least some of these issues are on the rise, and anecdotally, many of us probably feel like the rate of peanut allergies and all these other things seems to be increasing. And it's probably not only because we're more aware of these problems, it's probably because they really are getting more common. And so what I'd like to share with you today is how one of the important means of resolving inflammation and thereby preventing the problem of chronic inflammation, and one of the important means by which we create food tolerance, thereby avoiding food intolerances, is to use arachidonic acid, which is a fatty acid found in animal fats that traditionally has been seen as inflammatory. But I'm going to show you why that's really a misconception and why battling the problems of inflammation really means utilizing arachidonic acid. And as we're going through this presentation, I would recommend that you think about how have our diets changed over the course of the decades in which these problems seem to have become more common. Because I would wager that our intakes of arachidonic acid and vitamin A, which I'll talk very briefly about in this presentation, but which is also important in these issues, have really dramatically declined over the course of these decades. So arachidonic acid, shown here, is a fatty acid that has 4 double bonds that, if you were at my talk this morning, we talked about how each double bond makes a kink in the molecule. And since there's 4, arachidonic acid seems to curl up on itself, kind of like it's going into fetal position. But this is important not simply for the shape of the molecule, but because each of these sites between the double bonds is sufficiently unstable that it can be oxidized. And in my talk this morning, I talked about peroxidation of lipids as a harmful thing. And when it happens in an uncontrolled manner, it is a harmful thing. But these sites between the double bonds also allow our enzymes within our body to engage in controlled peroxidation reactions that allow us to take arachidonic acid and turn it into a bunch of other things that can be used to regulate the processes that the cells are engaging in. If you look at where arachidonic acid is found in foods, you can see that overwhelmingly the largest amount of arachidonic acid are found in egg yolks and liver. And it's harder to see the differences in these foods because I put duck egg yolk on here, which has so much more of it that it's shrinking all this data. But you can see up at the top, chicken egg yolks are the next best. We have various forms of liver, whether plain liver or pate. Kidney is not a bad source. And then you get, say, if you compare ox liver to beef steak, there's a lot more arachidonic acid in the ox liver than there is in the beef steak. But after we move on from egg yolks and liver, all those other foods are animal foods because arachidonic acid is found exclusively in animal foods. It's a fatty acid, so it's found in the fatty portions of animal foods. And you're going to find traces of it in animal fats like tallow and lard and so on. You're going to find more of it in fatty cuts of meat because you're getting the cellular membranes there. But again, it's really the liver and egg yolks that stand out. And if you think about the way diets have changed over the course of the last half century or a little more, livers disappeared, egg yolks haven't totally disappeared, but they've been demonized and people have avoided them to try to be health conscious. And all these other foods with smaller amounts, the animal fats, the meats, all these we've been cutting back on for health reasons. So I think it's fair to say that arachidonic acid intake has dramatically declined over the past 50 or 60 years. Now, arachidonic acid can also be derived from linoleic acid, which is a fatty acid that's found in plant oils. It's also found in animal fats in small amounts, but it's most abundant in the seed oils such as soybean oil, safflower oil, corn oil, sunflower oil, and so on. Although we can derive arachidonic acid from linoleic acid through several enzymatic conversions that are summarized right here, the conversion's often inefficient for several reasons. One is that doing so requires a wide array of nutrients, and it requires you to be pretty metabolically healthy. And also, there are genetic variations in the ability to make the conversion. So if you're lacking in any of these nutrients, or metabolically you're not all that healthy, or you just don't have the right genetics, you're not going to be very good at converting linoleic acid to arachidonic acid. Some of the helpful things are shown on the left in green. Some of the harmful things are shown on the right in red. The things that mechanistically we understand as most directly supporting this pathway are the B vitamins biotin and vitamin B6, and also insulin, which is increased in response to total calories and carbohydrate. But we also know that you need calcium, magnesium, zinc, and protein, even if the exact mechanisms behind those beneficial effects are less clear. Conversely, if insulin helps increase this conversion, then it follows pretty clearly that diabetes and insulin resistance are going to harm that conversion because these are diseases of poor insulin signaling. Diabetes and type 1 diabetes, you just don't have insulin, and type 2 diabetes, you're not sensitive to it. Alcoholism seems to impair this conversion. The consumption of oxidatively damaged oils and refined sugars seem to impair this conversion. And then finally, the more PUFA, meaning the more polyunsaturated fat, such as linoleic acid and arachidonic acid that you consume, you actually suppress these enzymes. So consuming a polyunsaturated fatty acid like linoleic acid may not be quite capable of maximizing the amount of arachidonic acid we can obtain anyway, because consuming a lot of PUFA tends to shut down this pathway. And even if everything else is optimized, there are still differences in genetics. So that if you're optimally healthy and you're consuming the perfect diet, you may have different genes for these enzymes than someone else, and you may be a better converter than that person or not as good converter than that person. So the most reliable way to get our arachidonic acid is to include some arachidonic acid itself in the diet. So we're back to consuming egg yolks and liver especially, and to a lesser degree other animal foods. Arachidonic acid has traditionally been seen as inflammatory because it can be converted to compounds called prostaglandins and leukotrienes that we know are involved in the initiation of inflammation. And that's certainly true. This happens through controlled enzymatic peroxidation of the fatty acid, which I mentioned before, and a variety of subsequent enzymatic conversions. And because there are so many enzymes involved in these pathways, there are actually a large number of different prostaglandins and leukotrienes that are produced, many of which all come together to regulate the initiation of inflammation. So arachidonic acid has traditionally been seen as a bad fat, and one of the most common ways to try to manage inflammation in modern society is to take over-the-counter drugs that inhibit the enzymes that make these conversions. These are the COX inhibitors or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail momentarily. So there are two conceptual issues that we should deal with when trying to understand what's really going on here in a way that's more nuanced than simply seeing arachidonic acid as inflammatory. The first thing we should consider is whether inflammation is really bad. Because we tend to talk about inflammation as if its main role in the body is to produce disease and death. And I've illustrated that sort of negative view of inflammation on the left. On the right, I have an alternative view depicted of inflammation, which I think is more realistic. And this is to see inflammation as a set of emergency responses that promote health when used in a manner and dose that's appropriate to the context. So yes, if the inflammation is used in a manner that's excessive or is not appropriate to the context, that's bad. But what's bad about that is not the fact that it's inflammation. What's bad about that is the fact that the context is wrong. So to draw an analogy, I'm bringing to mind the emergency responses in our society. We have firefighters and police, soldiers. We could even go on to preventative sanitation or however you want to see the management of public services. There's probably a point that pretty much everyone would agree is excessive use of these emergency response teams. So for example, probably almost everyone would agree that preemptively bombing everyone to wipe out the human race because if we don't, some problems will emerge is really excessive and not at all appropriate to the context. At the same time, we could probably all agree that having no response to emergencies and to never deal with any problems is also completely inappropriate to the context on the other end of the spectrum. And in the middle, we could have a lot of debates in society about exactly what is the right response to an emergency situation such as a potential war or crimes or fires or injuries or what have you. But I think we would all agree that there should be some response and in some context. And likewise with inflammation, scientists can debate about exactly what is healthful and exactly what is harmful. And if you look, for example, at atherosclerosis, we know that inflammation is involved in heart disease. But you could debate whether the inflammation that's going on is really the thing that we want to stop in heart disease. Because it's true that, for example, you could take lab animals and completely artificially delete their ability to engage in inflammation, and you would certainly see that certain aspects of the development of heart disease are impaired in that situation. But if you take those same animals and you take them out of the lab and into the wild, into the world that we all inhabit, they're all going to die way before they could ever get heart disease because they don't have the basics of the immune response that are able to counter pathogens. So if they're going to get exposed to something that would be totally innocuous in our environment, like the microorganisms that we're all breathing in right now, that are underneath our seat when we sat down, that are on each other's hands when we're shaking hands, because we have an immune system, all of these things are totally innocuous. And that's only because our immune system is responding to those things in the way that's appropriate to the context. So I think going forward, we first have to see that inflammation is not a bad thing. What we want is not to the absence of inflammation or to stop inflammation, but it's to control inflammation in the way that benefits our health. The second thing that we have to conceptually understand is that the absence of inflammation in someone who's totally healthy because they don't have food intolerances, they don't have chronic inflammation, that state is not a state of the absence of inflammation. It's not a state of the immune system having been dampened, having not responded. It's a state that is actively achieved by the immune system making it that way. Because the same system that initiates inflammation is the system that makes that inflammation go away when it's no longer appropriate. Okay, when you get pain or you get swelling, by and large, that's happening for a reason, and the system that caused that pain and swelling to appear in response to an injury is the same system that will make it go away when its role has been completed. Likewise, we don't tolerate foods because our immune system was never exposed to those foods. We tolerate foods because our immune system deliberately looked at those foods and said, that's a food, I'm going to deliberately organize this system so that the immune system recognizes that as food and tolerates it. So then the question becomes, well, how do we resolve inflammation, and how does the immune system decide to tolerate foods? And to answer that, we need to look at the role of arachidonic acid. So in arachidonic acid metabolism, when it's converted to prostaglandins, and I gave as an example here prostaglandin E2 or PGE2, which is one of the compounds that will come up several times in this talk, what we're doing is using an enzyme system called cyclooxygenase, or COX. And there are two well-established forms of COX, COX-1 and COX-2. And COX-1 is constitutive, some people say constitutive, it's the same thing in most tissues, and that means that you're always making COX-1 in order to constantly metabolize arachidonic acid into these chemicals for basic physiological processes. COX-2 is inducible in acute inflammation. And for a long time, there was a period of time where we thought if we inhibit COX-1, we get a lot of side effects, and we won't get those side effects if we instead selectively inhibit COX-2. And that's how we came up with Vioxx, for example, which was a selective COX-2 inhibitor. And that got taken off the market because it didn't at all do what it was supposed to do. Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One is that COX-2, when it's induced in acute inflammation, doesn't just initiate inflammation, it's also the thing that resolves inflammation and makes it go away. The second thing is that COX-2 is constitutive in the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which is the tissue in your intestines that houses the immune system. And COX-2 is the normal enzyme that's constantly produced in that tissue that allows the immune system to recognize and tolerate foods. So there's a couple of ways that we could try to understand what the role of these compounds is. One is to look at what happens when we don't have arachidonic acid in our tissues. The other is to look at what happens when we inhibit this process with COX inhibitors, which again are some of the most commonly taken drugs and are the drugs most commonly taken for pain in the world. Well, let's take this piece by piece. So the first thing is, what happens in essential fatty acid deficiency? Here you can see two tails. Each tail is the tail of a rat. This rat on the bottom was fed a diet that contained enough essential fatty acids to prevent deficiency. The one on the top is taken from a rat that was deficient. The deficient diet was not anything any of us would want to eat. It was based on purified sucrose and casein, which is milk protein, and other vitamins put into it. So it's not easy to produce levels of deficiency here. But what you are seeing is that this tail is scaly and rigid and flaky. And what you can't see in this black and white picture from the initial paper in 1929 is that it's also red and swollen. And we could guess that although the rats can't talk to us, they would probably say it's pretty itchy and irritated as well. In order to cure this deficiency, they used lard, supplying 0.44% of the diet as polyunsaturated fatty acids, or liver, supplying 0.12% of the diet as polyunsaturated fatty acids. So the easiest way to cure this deficiency is to eat even a small amount of liver. If they used isolated fatty acids, it took 1% of the diet as linoleate or linoleic acid to cure the deficiency. And arachidonic acid, they did it with 1/3%, and they didn't try any lower doses. I'm guessing lower doses would have helped. It eventually turned out that this deficiency could be clearly ascribed to not having enough arachidonic acid in the tissues to produce prostaglandins such as PGE2. There were other signs beyond the irritated, red, sore, swollen, and scaly skin. Those included dandruff, hair loss, decreased sex hormones, and infertility in both sexes. It's worth contemplating for a moment what produced the skin problems. One of the early controversies was that some people in some laboratories couldn't reproduce the eczema that was characteristic of essential fatty acid deficiency. And in the process of trying to figure out why some labs could produce it and some couldn't, it was discovered that the determinant was the amount of humidity in the air. And through that finding, it was discovered that what was happening was prostaglandin E2, taken from arachidonic acid, is needed to produce the proteins that form the junctions between your skin cells. And if you don't have junctions between your skin cells, you basically have skin in which things that shouldn't come in can come in, and things that shouldn't go out can go out. And so what was happening in the eczema was that all the water was evaporating from the skin, and the skin was becoming very, very dry. But they could also take toxic chemicals that normally wouldn't go through the skin, drop them on the skin of these rats, and have them go right through. So it was a two-way street. And the reason that the eczema wasn't developing in the laboratories with high humidity is because the humidity was suppressing the normal evaporation of the water from the skin, and so the skin wasn't drying out. Now, as it turns out, those same protein junctions between the skin that lead to the waterproofing of the skin are also present throughout the digestive tract. And so if you aren't producing those proteins, your whole digestive tract can become leaky and let things go in that shouldn't go in, let things come out that shouldn't come out. And so this could potentially underlie leaky gut, and it could potentially underlie things getting into the circulation that shouldn't, that are supposed to stay in the gut. And it's possible that that's one of the mechanisms of digestive disorders that are frequently seen with COX inhibitors, because those are some of the most common side effects. But there's more to the story than that. It's long been known that inflammation is self-limiting. What you see here is an experimental model of autoimmune arthritis. And what they did was they took mice here and they sensitized them to their own collagen. Basically, you could liken it to having vaccinated the mice against their collagen. And so since they artificially induced an immune response to the collagen, the mice develop an autoimmune disorder where they're attacking the collagen in their own tissues. But if you don't continue to stimulate the inflammation, you can see that after 45 days, it starts to naturally go away. And you can see after 70 days, it's the translucent gray areas that represent the swelling are basically gone, and that mouse has gone back to normal. Okay, so we've always known that if you take away the stimulus for inflammation, the inflammation will go away. The paradigm shift is coming in that now we are recognizing that the reason the inflammation goes away is not because it just passively disappeared. It's because the immune system deliberately said, okay, enough is enough, we've done our job, now it's time to return this tissue to normal. So if we take this same study, you can see that after the end of this study, this is the mouse that just went on without any drug treatment. If they added a COX inhibitor, you see this mouse. So taken from the same time point, you can see the translucent white areas representing swelling are very much still alive and well in the mouse that received a COX inhibitor, and they're gone in the mouse that didn't. And that's remarkable because COX inhibitors are supposed to inhibit inflammation. So if COX inhibitors inhibit inflammation, why is it the case that you get more inflammation when you have, yes, thank you. Why is it the case that you get more inflammation with the COX inhibitors than you get without it? And the answer is that although COX inhibitors inhibit the initiation of inflammation, they just as strongly inhibit the resolution of inflammation. What you see here is time passing on the bottom, and you can see it's divided into 3 stages: the induction of inflammation, the inflammatory period, and the resolution. And in the shaded area, that represents the amount of inflammation. So you can see it went up in the inflammatory period, then when the resolution period started, it went down. Then with the black line, you see COX-2 expression. That's how much COX-2 enzyme was produced. Remember, this is inducible in acute inflammation, so you have hardly any production of the enzyme at first, and then when you initiate inflammation, suddenly you're producing lots of COX-2. But after you start initiating the resolution of inflammation, COX-2 remains elevated throughout that entire period. And that's because COX-2 is not only governing beginning inflammation, it's also governing resolving inflammation. So you can see the inflammatory course with the mice that got no COX inhibitor in the dotted line here. And then in the solid black triangles, you see the inflammatory course in the mice that got the COX inhibitor. And so, yes, the COX inhibitor inhibited peak inflammation. So the worst of the inflammation was lower when they got the COX inhibitor. But at the end of the study, the mice that got the COX inhibitor, the inflammation stayed. It never went back to normal. So you got a stronger initial response in the untreated mice, but you also get a much stronger resolution and a better end result. Well, this is what we've mapped out to see what's actually happening here. On the left, you can see that arachidonic acid is metabolized by the COX enzyme to produce prostaglandins and leukotrienes that initiate inflammation, and all of this is shown in red. All of the things that resolve inflammation are shown in green, and passage from left to right represents the passage of time. One of those prostaglandins that initiates inflammation is PGE2, which I mentioned before. And this is the molecule that governs the conversion of arachidonic acid through another enzyme called lipoxygenase, or LOX, to pro-resolving molecules called lipoxins. So if you inhibit the COX enzyme, you get less of the pro-inflammation at the beginning. But because you have less PGE2, you never get a strong initiation of the resolving molecules, and you're stuck in the middle with chronic low-level inflammation. In addition, when this resolution stage is initiated, this LOX enzyme also takes DHA, which is found in marine oils, the omega-3 fatty acid, and metabolizes them into several other classes of molecules that resolve inflammation. So you could say that not having enough DHA from marine oils or from pastured animal products could contribute to chronic resolution. But the way that it does it isn't by interfering with the arachidonic acid metabolism. What you want is robust metabolism both of arachidonic acid and DHA. And so the way that you get that is to eat liver and egg yolks to supply the arachidonic acid, and to eat fish or cod liver oil to supply the DHA, or smaller amounts of DHA from things like pastured egg yolks and pastured butter and other animal fats. And what you certainly don't want to do is take drugs that inhibit these enzymes, because these enzymes are important for initiating inflammation you're supposed to have and for getting rid of that inflammation when it's no longer needed. Okay, so in addition to getting arachidonic acid in the diet, or rather not getting enough arachidonic acid in the diet, listed here are a few other ways that people are commonly impairing their own arachidonic acid metabolism. And that is that COX inhibitors constitute the most widely used pain-killing drugs in the world. Among them are the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as aspirin and ibuprofen and several others with their common brand names listed in parentheses. And there's also acetaminophen, which is most commonly known as Tylenol. That's not classified as an NSAID, but is still that should say I accidentally duplicated this title here. This should say non-NSAID COX inhibitors. So acetaminophen or Tylenol is a COX inhibitor, but for various reasons I won't go into, it's not classified among the NSAIDs. And then finally, there's the COX-2 selective NSAIDs, such as Vioxx and its close relatives, which have been taken off the market because they were supposed to be better than the other ones, and they proved to be a lot worse and to actually contribute to the heart disease that they were trying to prevent. Now, I put aspirin in green because aspirin, compared to these other drugs, has some unique characteristics. Aspirin is acetyl salicylate, and this is like the salicylates that occur in foods, but the key part of this is not the salicylate, it's the acetyl. And acetyl is basically a 2-carbon unit, and aspirin acetylates COX-1, which totally inhibits it. But when it acetylates COX-2, unlike the other NSAIDs, which basically just inhibit it, it has a more complex response. It does inhibit the production of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid, but it also modifies it in a way that causes it to produce specific pro-resolution compounds that ordinarily are not produced and are only produced in the presence of aspirin, both from arachidonic acid and from DHA. Oddly enough, there's another omega-3 fatty acid found in fish oils, EPA. In the absence of aspirin, EPA does not produce any pro-resolving chemicals. In the presence of aspirin, it does. Now, this probably indicates that aspirin is less harmful than the other NSAIDs. However, aspirin still prevents the production of prostaglandins, and prostaglandins, such as PGE2, have many of the benefits that I was talking about earlier, such as providing the integrity of the lining of the gut, providing the integrity of the lining of the skin barrier, initiating the normal resolution process, and many of the other things that we saw in essential fatty acid deficiency, like infertility, are all mediated by prostaglandins. So, although I think this indicates that aspirin is less harmful than the other NSAIDs, I really would be very cautious about using aspirin, and I wouldn't recommend it. The question should arise then, what about salicylates in foods? Many people aren't aware of salicylates in foods and probably don't need to be, but about 5% of the population are acutely aware of this, or should be acutely aware of this, because many people are intolerant of salicylates. And although many foods contain salicylates, they're most widely found in fruits, vegetables, and spices. And if you look at vegetarians who are consuming diets that are very rich in fruits and vegetables and other plant foods, they tend to take in an amount of salicylate that approximates very low-dose aspirin. But aspirin, like I said before, its effects are due to its acetyl group and not the fact that it's salicylate. So these salicylates in foods probably don't have the same effects on COX activity that I was just talking about. But aspirin itself is metabolized to salicylic acid, and both the salicylates in foods and this eventual product of aspirin do seem to actually make you make less of the COX-2 enzyme. And so it's possible that really large doses of fruits, vegetables, and spices could have a negative effect on the production of COX-2. That said, salicylate is normally detoxified using glycine, which we get from protein in general, but especially from bones and skin, and glucuronide, which we can make ourselves, but is also present in kombucha. And then we need to excrete it in the urine. So if any of these processes are impaired, that could make us more sensitive to salicylates. And so I think, although this isn't the complete answer, consuming a diet that includes not only meat, but also glycine-rich bones and skin in the form of bone broths and other gelatinous products, and maybe consuming kombucha could be helpful in being able to consume large amounts of fruits and vegetables without worrying about this. I think that would be a good thing because there are a lot of benefits of fruits and vegetable consumption. Okay, so this is so far how we resolve acute inflammation. There's more to say about how we create tolerance to foods. Apologize that this slide is a little bit busier than it needs to be, but I'll explain a few key parts of it. So this is representing the intestinal lining. On the top is the lumen of the intestine where our food goes through, and on the bottom represents the internal environment of the intestines. You can see here in red are food particles, and in green pill-shaped form are bacteria. And the immune system of the gut is meant to respond both to foods and to bacteria. It's supposed to respond to the bacteria by suppressing some bacteria that are pathogenic and allowing the free multiplication of bacteria that are beneficial for us, that constitute the normal microflora of the intestines. It's also supposed to take food particles, recognize them as food, and create tolerance to those food particles. So there are two main areas of the intestines that include the Peyer's patches and the mesenteric lymph nodes that are the areas where the immune system actually carries out these processes. And tolerance to foods probably takes place in both of these, but it's particularly in the mesenteric lymph nodes that are handling the food, and the Peyer's patches seem to be more important in handling the bacteria. So what happens is, in a very controlled manner, food particles, digested food particles, and undigested food particles, if they exist there, are deliberately taken across the intestinal barrier into these specialized areas. And cells called antigen-presenting cells, which look like these green splatters, take the food particle, and they take the other immune cells, and they say, food particle, meet the immune cell. Immune cell, meet the food particle. And in the correct environment, the immune system sees that food particle, recognizes that food particle as food, and then creates regulatory T cells, which are immune cells that govern all of the other cells of the immune system, the cells that attack things, the cells that make antibodies. All of these other things wind up under the control of these regulatory T cells that say, this is a food particle. Remember what this looks like and treat it like a food particle. There are several things that are necessary to create the environment that allows the tolerance for foods. And among the most important are retinoic acid, which is a derivative of vitamin A. And vitamin A intakes have likely declined a lot over the last half century because of the loss, especially of liver from the diet and cod liver oil. And COX-2 and prostaglandin E2, which are derived from arachidonic acid in the ways that I talked about before. So if you take the food particle into these specialized tissues and you don't have arachidonic acid and retinoic acid from vitamin A, either because your diet is poor in supplying the arachidonic acid or because you're taking COX inhibitors, you get an environment that is instead primed to not tolerate the food and treat it like it's a pathogen. So the basis for food tolerance is to actively use arachidonic acid and vitamin A to create an environment that specifically recognizes food as food. So I'm showing you now a couple studies that suggest COX inhibitors cause immunological food intolerances. This study is a study of mice who are sensitized to egg white, and you're seeing two ways of visualizing the intestines, one at the top and one at the bottom. These are small intestines where there are finger-like projections called villi that are very important to the digestion of our food. And you can see that in these animals who were primed to respond to egg white, their intestines were fine if they didn't get egg white, or if they got egg white with no COX inhibitor, or if they got COX inhibitors with no egg whites. But in the animals that got the egg whites and the COX inhibitors, you can see that these finger-like projections are flattened. That's villus atrophy, and it's one of the characteristic hallmarks of celiac disease. So these mice are getting something that in this instance looks a lot like celiac disease, but in response to egg whites. And it's clearly not just a reaction to the food itself, but also a reaction to the fact that COX inhibitors prevented those animals from tolerating the egg whites like they should. Here's a similar study, but done with gluten. Again, the mice who didn't get any treatment, got just gluten or just the COX inhibitor, had no problems. But when they got gluten and the COX inhibitor, the villi were flattened, constituting villus atrophy, again looking a lot like celiac disease, but here in a mouse. So I think it's reasonable to say that COX inhibitors or poor arachidonic acid status are probably contributors to food intolerances. That also raises the question then of how we should treat marine oils such as fish oil and cod liver oil. Fish oil and cod liver oil, as well as fish themselves, contain an omega-3 fatty acid called EPA. And throughout the 1990s, when inflammation was seen mostly as a process we want to inhibit in order to have health, there arrived the idea that we want a proper balance between arachidonic acid and EPA in our tissues. And that's because high amounts of EPA will inhibit the production of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid. And instead, you'll get fewer, weaker prostaglandins produced from EPA itself. And so if you wind up with fewer prostaglandins, and if they're a weaker form of prostaglandins, you wind up with less inflammation. But in the current model, where we're seeing these prostaglandins as necessary to creating food tolerance and to resolving chronic inflammation, this should cause us to ask whether there's a point above which we don't want a megadose with EPA. And so that should bring to mind for us some of the advice from some of the pioneers of cod liver oil, such as Weston Price and John Hughes Bennett, who very much recommended and used cod liver oil, but specifically recommended that the dose be moderated. If we take Weston A. Price as an example, he used 3/4 of a teaspoon of cod liver oil with 3/4 of a teaspoon of butter oil in children with tooth decay. He wrote that one of the benefits with butter oil was that if he combined them, he was able to reduce the dose of cod liver oil, which he found beneficial because high doses, in his experience, could cause toxicity symptoms. Although, unfortunately, he didn't describe in very much detail what that toxicity constituted. He recommended storing cod liver oil in small bottles to minimize the exposure to oxygen, and so it's probable that he was thinking that the toxicity was resulting from oxidation products of the fatty acids. But over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to make a case that even in the unoxidized form, in the wrong context, megadoses of EPA could potentially be harmful themselves. He wrote in his letter to his nieces and nephews that cod liver oil can be given in moderate doses without injury and to great advantage. Seldom, however, should a child be given more than a teaspoonful a day for extended periods because of toxic effects that often develop. John Hughes Bennett came before Weston Price. He traveled around the world studying the traditional use of cod liver oil as a folk medicine and studying the emerging use of cod liver oil within scientific medicine. And he said that the peasants of many countries who used cod liver oil as a folk medicine would take a half to a full pint every day when they would get sick and would repeat this for 4 to 8 days until they were cured. This is a massive dose, but it never lasted for much more than a week. By contrast, the people he called the medical men would give 2 to 4 tablespoons to adults and 1 to 3 teaspoons to children, or would even use it topically, including drops in the eyes, to augment the internal use. However, again, he didn't recommend these doses continue indefinitely. He wrote that it is now also well known that in many cases where the patient has taken it uninterruptedly for 6 or 7 months, and meaning at doses of 2 to 4 tablespoons for adults or 1 to 3 teaspoons for children, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, or other derangement of the digestive functions have arisen. It has been observed that the digestion has become gradually more and more deranged, and that even atrophy was thus occasioned. So I think John Hughes Bennett is valuable in supplementing our knowledge from Weston Price because he goes into more detail about the range of doses used, and also goes into more detail about the types of problems that were encountered by excessive use of cod liver oil. He also, so in addition to the gastrointestinal symptoms, he also said that itchy skin eruptions, excessive evaporation from the skin, and excessive menstrual bleeding could occur. And I find this fascinating that he says excessive evaporation from the skin, because that sounds very much like essential fatty acid deficiency, where the problem is you don't have enough arachidonic acid to make prostaglandins to ensure the barrier between the skin cells. So if it's the case that essential fatty acid deficiency causes that, and so does excessive doses uninterruptedly for more than 7 months of cod liver oil, it seems reasonable to say that the EPA itself in the cod liver oil could be being supplied at a dose that overwhelms the ability to make the normal prostaglandins from arachidonic acid, and is thereby preventing the normal production of PGE2 necessary to ensure the skin barrier, to ensure the lining of the gut, and to create tolerance to foods. And so I'd like to conclude by making a few points about the implications for how we should balance fatty acids in the diet. I showed you before that linoleic acid is converted to arachidonic acid through a number of enzymatic reactions that require many nutrients and metabolic health, as well as proper genetics. And this is also the way that we convert the omega-3 fatty acid abundant in certain plant oils, such as flax and to a lesser degree soy, into EPA and DHA, the omega-3 fatty acids that we get from marine oils or in smaller amounts from pastured animal products. This is the same exact enzyme system. And for that reason, this is the basis for saying that we should have omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids in the appropriate ratio in the diet. Because this system is omega-6, this system is omega-3. Now that's true if you're not consuming animal products where you would get your own arachidonic acid, EPA, and DHA from those foods. Where this becomes important is if you're on a vegan diet or you're a laboratory animal where they're just giving these specific fatty acids. Because if you have too much of this one, it'll compete for this conversion and you won't produce enough of this. If you have too much of this one, it'll compete for the same system and you won't produce enough of this. But if you're consuming liver and egg yolks, you're getting arachidonic acid, and if you're consuming fish and pastured animal products, you're getting DHA. And so the ratio of these fatty acids in the diet becomes less important. However, this exact same system under optimally functioning conditions converts EPA into DHA. And EPA is very abundant in marine oils, but if you have animals that are healthy and that have adequate omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids in their diet, you don't see a lot of EPA. You see mostly the production of DHA. And I think that reflects that in animals, in us, just like in the animals that we eat, like the chickens that are making our eggs, the cows that are making our butter, and so on, the critical fatty acid to have is DHA. But if you consume a small amount of EPA from a moderate dose of cod liver oil, much of that will be converted into DHA, and you won't be overwhelming your system with EPA, and so you won't be inhibiting the normal metabolism of arachidonic acid. But as I showed you before, there are a lot of nutritional factors, metabolic factors, and genetic factors that inhibit that enzyme system. And so that means that the average person who's not metabolically healthy, who doesn't have the right genes and doesn't have the right nutritional status, is not going to be very good at converting EPA to DHA. And I think that's going to make the average person more sensitive to having high amounts of EPA in their diet. And again, if the dose is small, I don't think it matters. But if you take someone and give them 2 tablespoons of cod liver oil in the context of a nutrient-poor diet and metabolic dysfunction, I think that's even more likely to lead to an amount of EPA that's going to overwhelm normal arachidonic acid metabolism. So I think the best bet is for the average person to take moderate doses of cod liver oil that supply a moderate amount of EPA to optimize other aspects of their health that optimize their nutrient status and their metabolic health. And then I wouldn't worry about that EPA so much because it's a small amount. A lot of it's converted to this, and we don't have to worry about it. I would add also that using high doses of fish oil rather than cod liver oil, I think is an even potentially more dangerous scenario because the fish oil is itself not providing many of the natural nutrients that are found in cod liver oil or fish oil, and it's simply providing a very large dose of EPA. And I think if I were to reflect on many of the things that I've seen happen in the Weston A. Price community and the paleo community over the years that these movements have existed, I think in the Weston A. Price community we've had many instances where people have taken really large doses of cod liver oil. In the paleo community, it's been more about the fish oil. In one of Rob Wolf's books, he has a fish oil calculator where the more metabolically dysfunctional you are, the more high-dose fish oil that you should use. So I think this happens across the alternative health communities. And in fact, I was initially tipped off to these phenomena by Laurel Crosby, who now is a researcher at Stanford University, because 10 years ago she was using 2 to 3 tablespoons of cod liver oil a day and then found out that she was intolerant to gluten, she was intolerant to casein, she was intolerant to this or that. And I think, it's hard to interpret anecdotes and stories even in large numbers, but I think probably the reason that we're so attuned to food intolerances in some of these communities is partly because if you're not looking for a food intolerance, you're not going to find it. And so there's more consciousness of food intolerances in these communities. That's certainly true. And to some degree, if we're not aware of the effects of COX inhibitors, many of us are probably managing our pain with that. But I think it's also true that many of us may have used really high doses of cod liver oil or really high doses of fish oil that could have precipitated and potentially initiated some of those problems from happening in the first place. So in my opinion, small doses in the context of a nutrient-dense diet, cod liver oil instead of fish oil because it's more nutrient-dense, in the context of a nutrient-dense diet and metabolic health, provide DHA for the resolution of inflammation without providing sufficient EPA to overwhelm arachidonic acid metabolism. By contrast, very large doses, or the context of a nutrient-poor diet or metabolic dysfunction, and especially the combination of all of those things, potentially supply an amount of EPA that could inhibit the ability of COX-2 to resolve inflammation and promote food tolerance. So I think the most critical things to do to resolve inflammation are, first, if there's chronic exposure to inflammatory stimuli, whether it's a food that you don't currently tolerate, a toxic environment, or a state of obesity and metabolic dysfunction that itself promotes inflammation, then of course you have to remove the stimulus. But if you have chronic inflammation and you remove the stimulus, that itself is not going to make the inflammation go away. I think the key things are to replete tissue stores of arachidonic acid and DHA with liver, egg yolks, and animal fats from pasture-raised sources. And that can include, of course, we wouldn't say fish or pasture, that could include small amounts of cod liver oil. And to eat a well-rounded, nutrient-dense diet that doesn't heavily restrict any one given food group to make sure that you're getting a rich amount of all the wide spectrum of nutrients. And then I would say avoid NSAIDs and other painkillers and any pharmacological anti-inflammatories except as needed to stop debilitating symptoms from interfering with sleep, work, and life. So certainly if you have chronic debilitating pain, you need to manage that in whatever way makes you functional. But because you have pain is not a good reason to take a painkiller. Because if it's tolerable and it's not debilitating, the best way that you can manage that is to let it run its own course. Okay, with that, I'll open the floor to questions. Thank you for your attention.
I'll use this one. I'm actually going to have you just step over to do questions because I'm putting the last slides in my talk. Thank you.
Hey there. So I'm curious how all this applies in the context of fat malabsorption.
Well, I think in fat malabsorption, you would potentially have problem absorbing these fatty acids.
Yeah.
And many other nutrients.
So, I mean, so in that context, even like the best diet and like getting saturated fats and omega-3s and all that kind of doesn't matter because you're not absorbing them at all.
I don't know. I mean, at all is extreme, but if you have fat malabsorption, you need to resolve the fat malabsorption because you're not going to absorb the nutrients. Not even just fat-soluble nutrients. There are, you're creating an environment of malabsorption, other things that aren't actually fat-soluble, like calcium, for example, is very poorly absorbed in a fat malabsorption syndrome, even though it's not fat-soluble. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's an absolute priority to manage the fat absorption, malabsorption, and in the moderate term and in the short term, it would be beneficial to get around that some way by either providing very large doses, maybe providing very large doses of vitamins or providing exogenous bile acids and lipases in a way that will assist the immediate absorption of the food, because you're probably going to have a lot harder time resolving any health issue, including fat malabsorption, if you don't have those nutrients. So I think it's a vicious cycle, and you have to kind of attack it on all ends. But certainly you need to resolve the fat malabsorption.
I guess I was mostly curious about being able to resolve inflammation with fat malabsorption, like issues.
You mean in the intestines?
Yeah, because it seems like this is talking about how fats play an important role in reducing inflammation. So is that process even possible in the context of fat malabsorption?
I think it would be made a lot more difficult, and so you would have a difficult situation that would have numerous factors all colliding to impair resolving that situation. So if you have inflammation, and it ties into other things like vitamin A. So, but people who have intestinal problems have lower vitamin A status than people who don't. Is that because the intestinal problem is preventing the absorption of vitamin A, or because the vitamin A deficiency is causing the intestinal problem? I think the answer is both. Mm-hmm. And so, you're stuck in that more difficult situation. I think the solution is try to attack every possible angle.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'd like to ask just two, if that's okay. That's okay. The first question is, have you ever come across a study or seen anything with antibodies being formed against probiotics in the case of like a leaky gut, a permeable gut? Like
I haven't looked at that, so I don't know whether it's out there, but it seems plausible because, I'm going to I'm going to say probably if leaky gut's going on, you probably have all these other problems going on. Mm-hmm. And the system that recognizes food as food is basically the same system as the system that recognizes beneficial bacteria as beneficial. So I would think that much in the same way you would get immunological intolerances to food, you would get immunological intolerances to what should be the normal microbiota. That's just an educated guess. I haven't looked at that research.
Okay. And you don't recommend, if you had said that removing foods is not really the way to go, it's optimizing.
What's not the way to go?
Removing certain foods, there's a ton of those sensitivity tests going on, and you're saying that that's not the way you would go about.
I think it really depends on the situation. So, in the case of someone with celiac disease where you have a very strong specific reaction to a specific food, then I would love to see the end goal to be restoring tolerance to that food. Certainly in the short term, it would be not very smart to not remove the gluten from the diet. If you have a case where, that can easily get run out of control. If you have a case where people are scoring off the charts in response to every food on a food intolerance test, mm-hmm. and you're removing everything, you're probably going to make the situation worse. But also, most of those tests are pretty questionable in and of themselves. So.
And you think it makes it worse because if you remove all the foods that lit up?
Well, you're not going to tolerate the food unless it's in your diet. That's for sure. But my main concern wouldn't be that. My main concern would be that the more restrictions you place on your diet, the more likely you are to become deficient in all kinds of things. So if you're removing one food and then you sort of say, okay, I'm removing this food, how do I make up for whatever's in that? It's pretty manageable. But if you're removing whole food groups or you're removing 100 different foods, the likelihood that you're going to be able to manage that diet and make it adequate in all the nutrients is really small. And you're probably not going to eat enough food anyway because variety is one of the things that impacts total calorie intake. And yes, some people eat too much, but someone who's restricting 100 different foods is very quickly going to not eat enough.
Thank you.
Thanks for your work. Context of the question is I have a daughter who's vegetarian, thankfully not vegan. And the topic of the question is EPA and DHA from food and absorption of it. I've read that Northern Europeans do a pretty poor job of absorbing those fatty acids from flaxseed oil and the like.
Who does?
Northern Europeans is what I've read. So I'm curious if you have any recommendations to improve EPA and DHA levels in vegetarians.
Well, I think the best thing to do is to get them from the diet, and you're not going to, you're certainly not going to fix genetic factors any other way in that case. But also you're not going to convince, particularly if she's vegetarian for ethical reasons, you're not going to convince a vegetarian to compromise their ethics for your hypothetical health concerns. So I think the thing to do is, what are vegetarian foods that supply those things? And I would say, I think the best example would be pastured egg yolks. Particularly if the chickens are actually eating insects, then they're going to have a significant amount of DHA. The amount of DHA that's required in the diet is really small, and so I think it would probably be better to eat some fish once or twice a week, and to also eat some pastured egg yolks. But I think the average person, barring some health concern, is probably going to get enough DHA with just the pastured egg yolks. So if you can convince her that, and maybe small supplement would be grass-fed butter.
She's good with eggs. Are there any plant sources worth mentioning, or is that out
She's
of the
what?
question? She's good with eggs, but are there any plant sources of DHA?
Well, the plants, no, but there is a algae-derived DHA supplement on the market that some vegans use.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm wondering what you can tell me about this inflammatory process and how it crosses over with IgE antibodies and food allergies.
The what process?
IgE antibodies, like food allergies.
Oh, how this interacts
right,
with IgE.
yeah.
Is that what you said? Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if it's been worked out in great detail. I'm not sure if it's been worked out in great detail, but I would think that probably in IgE allergies. So for people who don't know, the typical allergic response that we think of as an allergy is mediated by antibodies called IgE antibodies, and something like celiac is a different thing. So I think I'm going to wager a guess and say that this is relatively similar in nature, and so what's mediating the type of immunological intolerance is going to be other contextual factors, but the things that mediate tolerance are probably going to be the same.
Okay.
But that's my educated guess, and I can't confirm that with actual data.
Okay, thank you. So same thing, egg yolks, liver, little bit of cod liver oil.
Yeah, and I didn't talk that much about vitamin A because my talk wasn't about vitamin A, but I'll emphasize now that I think vitamin A is just as important as arachidonic acid.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, I was just wondering, so like the IgA and the IgG, like food allergy panels, is that the same as like food intolerance? Because it's the non-anaphylactic, just like people that show reactions or like food sensitivities to certain foods. Is that the same as what you're describing here as food intolerance? And also people that have a lot of foods that they're sensitive to that have like an immune response reaction or allergic reaction, can they eventually get those foods back?
Okay, well, I'll say I don't believe in IgA allergies. I think that there are some people out there who think that IgA responses to foods cause intolerances. Everything I've ever seen in the literature or in what I know about molecular immunology suggests that IgA is normally produced in the gut in response to foods as a way of preventing immune intolerances to the foods. Because one of the things that differentiates, if you have like an IgA antibody and IgE antibody, they may both bind to the same food particle. What differentiates them is that the other side of the antibody on IgE takes that food particle and stimulates all the immune responses that mediate an allergy, and the IgA takes that food particle and does nothing with it. So because the IgA particle itself doesn't stimulate the immune response, it's basically a way of cleaning up undigested food particles in the intestines and preventing immunological responses to it. If there's IgA reactions to the food in the blood, then maybe that indicates an intolerance of some sort, but I doubt it indicates a specific intolerance of that food. It maybe just means that those things are getting into the blood more easily than they should because the IgA antibodies could be in the intestines. But I'm super skeptical of the validity of those blood tests. So I think, if it's a means of trying to brainstorm self-experiments to see if removing the food helps you and it helps you, then fine. But if you have no discernible reaction to those foods, and the only evidence that you react to the foods is that you have positive IgA and IgG antibodies in a blood test, then I would not take that as evidence that the foods need to be removed.
Okay.
That's my thought.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm a little bit confused because I have been told by chiropractors, et cetera, that taking fish oil is good for you. And what you're saying, from what I could gather, is that you should really not take fish oil, or maybe in small amounts. So what's a small amount of a fish oil? Should you take it or should you not take it?
Yeah, well, if no one was saying that, I wouldn't have bothered to say what I said about fish oil. So, I was vague because there's not enough information to be more specific.
Right.
And I would say, first of all, with fish oil, I wouldn't take fish oil because you can get those fatty acids by eating fish, and fish provides a very wide spectrum of nutrients that you're not going to get from that oil. And so if you have some theoretical limit of EPA that you should be consuming, why would you waste it on fish oil when you can eat fish? I mean, it's more enjoyable. I mean, unless you don't like fish, but if you
Well,
eat
I
the
know
fish...
when I broke
yeah.
my wrist a while back, the chiropractor said take fish oil. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Rancid
You know,
food.
I went to an ophthalmologist once with a severe problem with my eyes that I thought was infectious conjunctivitis. Turned out that it was just really bad irritation from dry eyes. And so when I think dry eyes, I think vitamin A deficiency. And my ophthalmologist didn't even ask me if I eat carrots. He said, take fish oil to manage the inflammation. So I think that some chiropractors are very knowledgeable about nutrition. Some ophthalmologists are very knowledgeable about nutrition. Chiropractors, ophthalmologists, medical doctors, none of them are actually trained in nutrition. So a lot of what a medical professional is going to tell you who isn't a nutrition professional is going to be what anyone else on the street would tell you. And I'm going to bet you that if you just took anyone at a particular health-associated conference where people were relatively knowledgeable, they would have said the same thing to you, and that's because fish oil has been seen as an anti-inflammatory. But what I'm saying now is all of that conceptually comes from the outdated model whereby the key to managing inflammation is to stop it. And that's no longer a tenable model. So in my opinion, I think it's useful to take cod liver oil to supply vitamins A and D. I would do what Weston A. Price did and take 3/4 of a teaspoon. But even that depends on the rest of your diet, right? So if you're eating liver 2 times a week and you're out in the sun all the time, you probably don't need vitamins A and D from the cod liver oil. If you're eating fish once or twice a week and you're eating pastured egg yolks every day, I don't think you need the omega-3 fatty acids either. So maybe cod liver oil is not for you. If you find it hard to eat liver, or you find it hard to get out in the sunshine, or you don't like fish, maybe cod liver oil is for you because it covers all those bases. It's a contextual thing. What I'm saying isn't that I know a specific amount of fish oil that you shouldn't take. What I am saying is you shouldn't use high doses of fish oil whose purpose is to combat the inflammation. Or if you do, then you should recognize that what you're doing isn't any more natural than taking an over-the-counter NSAID. So I'm not saying never take fish oil. I'm just saying when you're using high doses of EPA in order to inhibit arachidonic acid metabolism, you're out of the scope of nutrition and you're into pharmacology. And so, maybe that's appropriate sometimes, but people who use that approach should know that it's a pharmacological approach and that it carries the same risk-to-benefit ratio as using over-the-counter medications that do the same thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Chris, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is there arachidonic acid in butter?
I think there should be traces of
Yeah.
arachidonic acid
So
in
the
butter.
animal fat,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, okay.
But the amounts are sometimes very small.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the amounts of arachidonic acid in animal fats are very small, but the animal experiments that I showed you from 1929 found that foods were way more effective than the isolated oils.
Yes.
And so I think that's because even the traces are really important.
Do you have any thoughts on treating somebody who has food intolerances to all animal products?
No.
Okay.
That sounds like a very difficult situation to manage, and I don't think that it's any different than a large number of food intolerances to other things. So I would first of all look at the quality of the evidence for that. So if it's if it's very clearly demonstrated that every time I eat this thing, this happens, and that it's the same across these foods, then probably that person needs to stay away from those foods and slowly ease into a situation where they're getting the nutrients from other sources. And you have to kind of take that on a case-by-case basis. It would take a long time to talk about every single nutrient that's in animal products and how to get it from plant products. It's necessarily more limited depending on the exact situation. Maybe supplements and other things come into play. I think that would be a very difficult situation to work with. But it's always, I would say in any case, if you know that every time you eat this bad thing happens, then at least for the time being, don't eat that thing. and then if you can't eat the things that are providing those nutrients, then you just need to say, where can I get them from other foods? Is it warranted in this specific, unusual context to use supplements or whatever else? It would really be a case-by-case basis that doesn't have a quick answer.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey there. So the rule of thumb that I've read online a lot and like through other nutrition sources is that omega-6s are generally pro-inflammatory and omega-3s are inflammatory, and that's why you want a balance of them because they obviously balance each other out. But then we're seeing that omega-3s inhibit the reduction of inflammation in high numbers. So I guess can you just speak on the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s and how that relates to inflammation?
Yeah, so what you're saying is what I would consider the outdated model that came basically out of the 1990s.
Okay.
And part of that was motivated by seeing high intakes of marine oils in the Inuit and trying to say, is there benefit to this, and looking at people on the American Western diet have low levels of omega-3 in their blood and high levels of omega-6. And then what I showed you as the conventional idea was the idea that drove that if arachidonic acid is inflammatory, then we need to balance it out with EPA in order to be anti-inflammatory. So I think that, if you look at the COX enzyme, it's clearly meant to metabolize arachidonic acid because it takes a lot of EPA to inhibit arachidonic acid metabolism. That enzyme, if you give equal amounts of arachidonic acid and EPA to that enzyme, it will very much preferentially utilize the arachidonic acid. You really have to have a lot more EPA than arachidonic acid in order to strongly inhibit the enzyme. But I don't think it's about having a precise ratio, and I think that's sort of impossible to manage because you can control your ratio in the diet, but you can't control the ratio in your body, which isn't going to look like what your diet looks like anyway, because your cells regulate what they put in there, you're interconverting different fatty acids and so on and so forth. So the only thing I could say about the ratio is, like I said before, if you're not consuming arachidonic acid and DHA in the diet, it's very important to manipulate or balance the ratio of the precursors in plant products. Most of the people in here, that doesn't apply to them. And so I don't think it's about having the ratio. I think it's about having both the arachidonic acid and the DHA in the cell membrane. And I think if you have some EPA in there, the enzyme is selective for arachidonic acid and it's not going to make a big difference. What you don't want is, to put it another way, the dose that you don't want is the dose of fish oil that someone would use to get themselves off of an NSAID to manage an inflammatory disorder, right? So if 6 to 10 grams of omega-3 fatty acids has the same effect as an over-the-counter NSAID, then it has the same side effects as the over-the-counter NSAID. But if EPA happens to be in the diet because you eat fish or other whole foods on a regular basis, I don't think that's a problem. I don't know where the line is, so I can't draw it perfectly clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. I eat a nutrient-dense diet and go outside in the sun quite a bit and have been taking a moderate or possibly now slightly high level of cod liver oil dosage. But my blood tests always show that I have low vitamin D levels. Do you know why that might be?
It's hard to say without looking at it more comprehensively. So if your 25-OHD is low, which is the typical marker that's used to look at vitamin D nutritional status, if that's low, it could be low for a number of reasons. One is that you're not getting enough vitamin D. One is that you're not getting enough calcium. If you don't get enough calcium, then your body uses up vitamin D a lot faster than it otherwise would. So getting high calcium is just as important. If you have a lot of vitamin A in your diet, that helps use up the vitamin D by converting it to the active hormonal form. And I think that's probably a good thing because it's actually increasing the vitamin D activity of your blood. Whereas there's a variety of bad things such as cancer, and I'm not suggesting you have cancer, but cancer and inflammation also use up vitamin D in ways that are bad. So it could be that you're not getting enough vitamin D, but it could also be that you're converting it to the active hormonal form at a higher rate for good reasons or bad reasons. There's also a lot of genetics involved. But I think one thing that would be useful would be to get your parathyroid hormone levels measured, because if it's any of the good things that are increasing the vitamin D biological activity in your blood, that should suppress your parathyroid hormone even further. And if it's any of the bad things that mean that you're actually deficient, that should raise your parathyroid hormone. So I would say if your parathyroid hormone, the reference range is really wide, but I would say if you're in the upper half of the reference range for parathyroid hormone, you probably should consider yourself in need of more vitamin D. If you're towards the lower half of the reference range, you probably shouldn't worry about it. By the way, what does low mean? How low?
I'm sorry. Oh, I don't remember offhand. I just remember it was low.
Well, everyone has a different idea of what's low, so that's an issue to consider too.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I think that you mentioned that you recommend to prevent the inflammation stimuli during the
Prevent the what?
Inflammation stimuli.
Mm-hmm.
Stimuli during the inflammation is occurring, and does that mean that with the sufficient arachidonic acid and a healthy conversion to prostaglandin, and then it resolves the inflammation? Once it resolves the inflammation, then that person can be immune to the inflammation stimuli, and then that person can again be in contact with that inflammation stimuli.
That really depends on the specific stimuli in the context. So some things are inflammatory stimuli that should be, and some are things that shouldn't be, right? So It's normal if we get an infection to initiate an immune response. It's normal if we get cut or injured to initiate an immune response. It's not normal to eat food and initiate an immune response to the food. It's not normal to attack our own tissues and have an autoimmune condition. Mm-hmm. So it really depends on what the stimulus is. Uh-huh. If you get an infection, the inflammation should resolve itself the way we discussed. But I really hope that inflammatory response is there next time you get the same infection, because that's why you're alive. And if we had no immune system, and our immune system didn't respond, even the bacteria in our skin that are naturally there would eat us alive. Now, on the other hand, if you're talking about something that should be tolerated well, then it's quite possible, I think it's a theoretical point right now, but it's quite possible that you could reverse that intolerance and create tolerance with these pro-resolution factors. Mm-hmm. But I think right now that's a hypothesis. Mm-hmm. I think it's clearer that this is the pathway to not ever getting food intolerances, and I hope it's also the pathway to get rid of food intolerances that are already there. Mm-hmm. But I think in order to say, okay, I've proven that using this all you celiacs can eat gluten now, and all of you people with allergies can start eating the things you're allergic to, I hope that's the case, but no one's really shown that to be the case. So it's a gray area, and I could say if there's a way to help, probably this is the way there. But exactly to what degree we can help get rid of existing problems is something that we're going to have to research more.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, thank you, everyone.